Imagine you're a sailor on a ship, tasked with regular maintenance and normal routine on the vessel. Not a particularly risky or interesting position on the ship. One day you are asked to go into the chain locker, a small room where the anchor chain is stored when not in use, and asked to secure the chain so it doesn't rattle around and make too much noise. You enter through the small top hatch in the room, and within seconds, you pass out. On September 23rd, 2007, 3 men unfortunately lost their lives when entering the chain locker on the ship Viking Isla. They were not physically injured, and the room was not full of any particularly toxic substance. Nevertheless, all 3, one after another, each lost consciousness quickly, and they were unable to be resuscitated. So what happened in this room that caused them to pass out? The answer is something incredibly basic: iron and oxygen. What happened to them was the result of chemical reactions that all of us have seen hundreds of times, that happens all over the world every single day. In most circumstances, it's entirely harmless, but with the right combination of factors, it can be incredibly dangerous, even deadly. Let's take a look at the science. This, of course, is a candle, and at the top, a flame. Now, fire needs 3 things to exist. It needs a fuel source, it needs oxygen, and it needs heat. The fuel in a candle is the wax of the candle itself, and ever so slightly the wick. Specifically, the wax from the candle, it's melted by the heat of the flame. It travels up the wick where it is further heated and vaporizes, and that vapor is able to burn. The oxygen is coming from the air all around us. The heat originally came from the match, and once it starts burning, it has a sustaining heat which allows it to keep going. Normally, as a candle burns, taking oxygen out of the air, all of that air just gets replaced. It can flow around, it can move, so air that still has oxygen will fill the same spot. This is an oxygen meter, and it's showing that the oxygen in this room is 20.9%, which is pretty much exactly what you would expect. And even if I hold it close to the candle, it's not going to go down because the air is able to move around and circulate. But watch what happens if we prevent new air from getting to the candle. This is not a hermetically sealed container or anything. There are tiny little gaps at the bottom. It could pull new air in, but at pretty low volumes, and it's going to use up oxygen more than it gets replaced. The oxygen in the container has already started going down. We just hit 20% and still dropping. At 18.5 or 6%, the flame on the candle is already noticeably smaller than it was when we put the jar over it. Of course, the lower the candle flame goes, the slower it's using up oxygen, so it slows down how fast it's changing, but it is still burning, and so the oxygen keeps dropping. At 17% oxygen, the candle extinguished itself because there was no longer enough oxygen in this jar for it to keep burning. Take the jar off and watch as our oxygen quickly climbs back up to 20.9%. There it is. Fire is probably the form of oxidation that most people are the most familiar with. Most things that we think of as fire or burning are chemical reactions of oxygen combining with other stuff. But fire is not the only form of oxidation. Oil turning rancid is a form of oxidation. It's the oxidation of unsaturated fatty acids. Some fruits like apples or bananas will turn brown if you cut them open and expose them to the air. Also oxidation. Now you're all familiar with iron, and iron really likes to combine with oxygen. It's not as fast or as violent of a reaction as combining with, say, hydrogen, but it happens often, everywhere in the world, all day, every day. I am talking about rust. Rust is formed when iron oxidizes. Oxygen combines with the iron to form one of several compounds that are known as iron oxides. And in doing so, it actually uses up all of the oxygen around it. Or it would, but like with a candle, that air can easily be replaced most of the time. Let's watch iron use up the oxygen in a container where it can't be easily replaced. You know, in this case, for iron, I'm using steel wool, and steel is almost entirely iron with just a little bit of carbon in it. The carbon does not prevent it from bonding with oxygen. Now, steel wool, left on its own devices, will usually eventually rust. To make sure it does rust at a speed that we can see on camera, I'm going to help it along with, this is some vinegar with salt mixed into it. Those are both going to speed that reaction up. Also going to make my workshop smell like vinegar. Not a huge fan. This steel wool is going to be in this container. The water is going to prevent any new oxygen from being able to enter this cylinder. All right, while we've got this experiment running, I need to feed the dog. You've met River. He's the pup here in the house, and you may have even seen him pop up in a couple of past videos. Now, making sure River has a good life and a good diet is super important, which is why I'm working with today's video sponsor, Farmer's Dog. He has been on the Farmer's Dog food for about 2 months, and his coat is noticeably softer. He has great energy and is very happy, aren't you, bud? And delivery has been so convenient. After I set up his food order, the boxes just arrive on their own. Recently, we went to the lake for a few days and River was playing all day long, non-stop. I needed to bring his Farmer's Dog food on the trip. I literally used the free travel bag and fridge container. It was so useful. When I started River on this new diet, I immediately noticed all of the simple, fresh ingredients. Like, this is a high-grade food, not burned, processed kibble. The whole experience is great, from start to food in the bowl. Going crazy. I know, you're a big fan. Look how much he loves his Farmer's Dog food. Yeah. I can tell you that this company has taken a lot of care into making dog food a fantastic and personalized experience. You guys need to get in on this for your pups. Farmer's Dog has a great deal right now of 50% off your first box. Yeah, 50%. So use my link down in the description or scan this QR code on the screen and start your dog on a happier life with healthier food. All with free shipping and 24/7 customer service included. Go try it out. Just look at this happy pup. Let's go see how our experiment's doing. This is how much water it pulled up, and it didn't stop pulling because the reaction stopped. It ran out of water at the bottom here. Like, there's nothing left for it to grab. It looks like there's water. No, that's water underneath the plate. It pulled every bit of water that was in this pie pan up inside the cylinder. It reached the steel wool. That is quite an impressive job. I'm gonna let it out now. It also messed with the color. I think the orange of the rust interrupted the blue food coloring. Oh my gosh. So yeah. Oh, yep. That was good. That was real good. So that is the power of the steel wool, pulling the oxygen out of the air and binding it to the iron. Crazy. I want to do another experiment that shows a similar property, but if the container isn't sealed. Similar to a chain locker, is mostly closed off, but is open enough that gases could seep in if there was a low pressure zone. So I'm going to put steel wool inside this clear box with an O2 meter, and we're going to see how low the oxygen content in that box gets. So I set this up, and then there were actually a couple times where I slid the box off the side of the table just enough to pull some steel wool out, spray it with more salty water, and put it back in. Of course, when I did that, there was air exchange going inside and outside of the box. The lowest I saw this meter getting down to was around 11%. Now, 11% is an extremely dangerously low percent of oxygen. That's not an environment where people can stay conscious for any extended amount of time. And you can see how rusted our steel wool got. In fact, it's so rusty that it really is starting to fall apart on its own, like barely holds itself together. Iron oxide is not as robust as steel wool, at least not this form of it. Oh my gosh, that is rusted all the way through. So you might think, if it's not an airtight seal, when the oxygen gets depleted, the same way it was doing in the cylinder, that would create some suction. It would create a low pressure zone inside the box. So wouldn't the air get replaced? And to some extent, yes. There was no seal. Air would have been pulled in under the small cracks at the bottom of the box. But if we assume that air is replacing oxygen in a 1-to-1 volume, so you end up with a smaller total percent of oxygen. So some of the oxygen in the newly introduced air would also help convert into rust, and that would pull in some more air, but that would be an even smaller percent of the oxygen. So you'd get diminishing returns over and over and over until you just had a box full of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and a few other trace elements with just the oxygen itself stripped out. Now on our oxygen meter, we didn't get down to a point where a person would fall unconscious nearly immediately, but we did get to a point where it would be very dangerous after only a very short amount of time. Of course, our steel wool was in this box for about 16 hours, not several months. So you can see how that problem could compound and build until there was really just zero oxygen left in that box. For a long time, it was assumed that when iron rusted, it was breaking down and it was losing something about what it was made up of. The assumption would have been that if you were to carefully weigh a piece of iron before and after it rusted, that it would lose mass rather than gain it. But in the late 1700s, a French chemist named Antoine Laurent Lavoisier apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, proved that iron actually gains mass when it rusts. Nowadays, we can do a pretty simple experiment with our nice, cheap, sensitive equipment to show the same thing. Got a nice sensitive scale here. We're gonna start off with a bit of steel wool right inside our little aluminum bowl we've got. You can see we're at 2.63, maybe 2.64 grams. We're gonna light this steel wool on fire and see how the mass changes. Take a look. So briefly, we actually watch the weight go down. The heat from the burning steel wool is warming up the air around it. That warm air is expanding and becoming less dense and leaves the bowl. But quickly, the steel wool starts to bond to oxygen, and that gets added to its weight. We can see it rising up above where it was when it started. It's not a huge change in mass, but it has gone up from where it was at the beginning. The added mass is from oxygen. Another cool thing about this reaction is that it is exothermic. It creates heat, and that's something that normally you aren't going to see. You know, if you've got a chain or a fence or a, just a piece of any metal that starts rusting, it's gonna happen very slowly. You're not going to notice, you're not going to feel any heat. But there is a way that plenty of people have experienced where they do feel that heat, and that is through these little hand warmers. These little packets are full of iron powder, and when you open them, this container around them that is permeable to air lets oxygen get to that powder, and it begins reacting and heating up. So along with the iron, I think there's actually some other stuff, including maybe some little traces of water in these, because there is a lot of steam coming off. Now, that might just be that it's pulling water out of the air, as the oxygen and water that is in the air is what causes this reaction to happen. I'm not sure about that, but just right when I first pour them out, they do seem to be maybe just the tiniest bit damp, so I don't know for sure, but it's possible that there's a tiny bit of moisture in there already, because there's a lot of steam coming off of these. Feels like more than 140. Oh, it's up to 160. I was so curious about what's in these that I had to look up a more specific answer to what all is in the packet. And while they do, as I said, have iron, and I was right about them having a little bit of water, they also have some salt, activated charcoal, and vermiculite mixed in as well. All of that, I'm sure, to try and control the speed and strength of the reaction and how long it holds heat. Pretty cool. Rust mostly seems harmless. We see it and encounter it all of the time. But you think of something like this rusty chain multiplied by 1,000 in a confined room that also has steel or iron walls, and you see where the danger comes from. A cramped space full of iron, regularly exposed to seawater when the anchor chain was brought in, rusted to the point where there was no oxygen left in the room. While there may have been gaps in the walls or the bulkhead that allowed air to get in a little, it wasn't enough for a true exchange of air to replace the oxygen missing from the room. That was the source of the danger. So although it's pretty rare, in the right circumstances, rust can go from inconvenient to lethal. Here I'm spraying some 3% hydrogen peroxide onto the steel wool, which makes it rust basically instantly. Looks pretty cool. Huge thank you shout out to all of my supporters on Patreon. I do post a lot of behind the scenes stuff for some of my videos and projects, so if you're interested in seeing that, you should check it out.